Week 4 of the NFL is now in the books after that snooze fest of a Monday night game versus the 49ers versus the Rams. So I'm assuming most people are asleep now, but we at TwinTakes here are not, because we got to get through some studs of the week, some duds of the week, and a really, really important waiver wire section after very rampant injuries kind of hit a lot of the running back room this past week. So remember, like the video, subscribe, that button right there, and cue the intro. Welcome back into TwinTakes Fantasy Football, and boy, the NFL has not let us down so far. 4 weeks into the season, every single weekend has come with its twists, its turns, ups and downs, and tremendous storylines that we get to talk about on this little section of YouTube discussing fantasy football. So without further ado, let's get into our first headline. And we would not be a football show if we did not talk about Tua, the Dolphins, and concussions. Yeah, it has to be addressed. So first and foremost, obviously, it's terribly scary what happened to Tua, and I just hope that he's okay. I hope that the NFL now, after the second injury, whatever they want to call the first one and the second one, are taking the proper precautions to make sure that he is okay, that his long-term health is not in jeopardy, and that he can return to doing what he loves in a normal, safe, and healthy way. Obviously, that's the most important part, is to his health. But in my personal opinion, as an idiot, not a doctor, just some moron on the internet who's talking about fake football, I do believe versus the Bills that he did get a concussion, and then 5 days later versus the Bengals, he suffered a second concussion. And normally when you suffer concussions that close together, the second one, the symptoms are highly exaggerated because of the brain still being bruised. A lot of people are talking about Tua going to the fencing position. I think there was actually something that concerned me a little bit more called decorticate posturing, which is what his fingers were doing while he was down on the ground. I'm not going to demonstrate. You've probably seen it all over Twitter at this point, and the copious replays that Amazon Prime did, to the chagrin of many viewers. But that's normally indicative of a lesion right above the brainstem, which is why I was really concerned, and on Thursday night thought that he might never ever play football ever again, let alone lead a normal, healthy life. So thankfully he was released from, listen, I'm going to trust the level 1 trauma center. If they say he's okay, I'm going to go with that. He's okay. They said that he cleared, was fine. MRI came back positive. I'm very glad to hear all that stuff. So hopefully now that he's been put in proper protocol, is going to be out for at least a couple weeks for testing and making sure there's no long-term lingering effects, that he can make a full and healthy recovery back to the field. Now, what does that mean for fantasy? Well, I'm likening this back to what COVID did to fantasy football a couple years ago. As soon as someone came in a positive test, even if it was a false positive, they were out for about 10 days. Now with a heightened sensitivity around concussions and what we saw and the mass public outcry against what happened to Tua, we're going to be seeing if there's even any sort of wavering, dizziness, instability in a player after they received a hit to the head, they'll be put in concussion protocol. And I believe that being said, it's going to be a much longer protocol process than was previously used in the NFL. So if you look back in week 1, we saw T. Higgins leave with concussion, entering the protocol, and then he was back the next week. I believe you can probably treat it the exact same way they treated COVID, probably a 10-day wait list. If anyone tested in the week coming up to it that they were either put into COVID or, for this example, put into concussion protocol, they will probably be out that following game, just for the sake of safety. So hopefully your leagues have IR spots, because I believe a lot of players that even show remote signs of concussion symptoms are going to be put on IR or be marked out for games following further testing. And that's going to really require you to manage the waiver wire a little bit better, and really dig for those really obscure fantasy names like we had to do back in 2020, when before the vaccine, before COVID was really under control. So heightened precautions are going to lead to longer recovery times, longer wait times, and added sensitivity around rushing players back. So if anyone happens to leave in a game, I would not anticipate them coming back into the game. I would not anticipate them being ready to go for the next game afterwards. So make your preparations accordingly. And so that's, again, I normally don't want to talk about the Hill stuff and how it relates to what we do here, sitting and playing fantasy football players for money and gambling, but that's going to be the impact that I think is going to have on fantasy football games for us. So, all right, after that uncomfortable topic, let's move on to something else that's actually fantasy related. The Raiders got their first win. No longer any winless teams in the NFL, both the '08 Lions and the 2016 Browns. Their record is still safe, going absolutely winless. The Broncos continue to struggle, and that only got worse with Devonte Williams' injury, torn ACL, torn PCL, and an LCL injury. I would not even expect him to be ready by the start of next season, if we're just being cautious regarding a knee injury of that significance. And we saw that even before he got injured, that Hackett had kind of made that shift and was giving Devonte about 67% of the snap count for the running back position for the Broncos, was really heavily involved, was taking more of that lead RB1 spot. So now they have to go back, and now after it started to click, their offense was clicking. Russell was actually making throws. Courtland Sutton looked good. Jerry Jeudy was making good catches. And then, of course, a huge wrench is thrown into them with the injury of probably one of their most talented players in Devonte. So they're going to have to go back to the drawing board with Melvin Gordon and Michael Boone. They also signed Latavius Murray, I believe, was the news that came out today. So it's going to be a very interesting running back by committee over there up in Mile High. And this, unfortunately, I think is a sign of things to come. I would not be playing Russell Wilson. I am very, very scared to play Jerry Jeudy. I'm very adverse to any of the running back situations there. Their tight ends, Alex Okwuegbunam, hasn't really broken out the way people thought he was going to. Courtland Sutton might be the only fantasy-relevant asset up there in Mile High. But their continued struggles, losing to the Raiders, who were presumably one of the worst teams in the NFL, as well as losing one of their primary playmakers, makes them someone that I am avoiding with a 10-foot pole. And also, on the other side, the Raiders finally got their first win. We finally saw them actually utilize some of their offensive weapons. Josh Jacobs went off for an amazing game, and maybe things are starting to finally click over there in Las Vegas for Josh McDaniels and his team. Only took him about 3 weeks, but hopefully with the amazing weapons that they have, with Darren Waller, with Devontae Adams, Hunter Renfrow, Josh Jacobs, hopefully they can actually put together some semblance of a competent offense and continue on their winning ways and actually make this AFC West division somewhat competitive, like we anticipated it to be in the offseason. Third headline that we got to talk about, weather. Yes, that was a horrible Buffalo and Ravens game, and we knew going into the game that there was going to be pretty adverse weather and it's going to adversely impact the players. But we had the two MVP candidates, two front runners in Lamar and Josh Allen. We had two of the best pass catching options in Mark Andrews on the Ravens side and Stephon Diggs on the Buffalo Bills side. And the weather everyone's anticipating a shootout. It was the highest scoring under-over on the week and didn't come to fruition. I believe the under-over came down about 8 points once the scope of the weather impact was fully known right before the game. I believe it was like 51 down to 43.5 was the line shift. So that's a tremendous line shift. And yeah, I mean, Vegas was spot on. It ended 23-20. So their line was bang on perfect. And the main takeaway here is no matter if we're dealing with two MVP candidates, two of the most dynamic offensive weapons that we've seen, two of the most explosive offenses in the NFL this year, they were really stymied by this adverse weather. Not even the gloves were helping the receivers. Rashad Bateman had an absolutely abysmal performance. Devin Duvernay really redeemed his point total based on a kind of a broken play that he kind of snatched out of the air after it bounced off people's hands a couple times. Balls were just shooting out of people's hands, and the run game was getting going. That's why we saw J.K. Dobbins finally have his breakout game. But this is just something that we need to know. This was, I guess, in my mind, the prove it game for, hey, listen, does talent supplement weather, or can we ignore adverse weather when it comes to two of the most talented quarterbacks in the league? And the answer is no. The answer is no. We have to continue to make decisions based on these inane factors that have nothing to do with football, and we don't really know until right before the game starts. So it's good to know. At least we got that out of the way early this season. So again, I guess going to be the weatherman here and try to predict weather and cold fronts, warm fronts, hurricanes, storms, all that other fun stuff, and avoiding games that are going to be impacted by that. And even on the ground, it was not the best, where we saw a couple fumbles, a couple loose balls, handoffs weren't crisp, they weren't clean. Just the whole sogginess and disgustingness of the field just, kind of soured the fantasy upside of that game. So I mean, this was a perfect example with two of the most perfect teams in the NFL for fantasy right now. And I guess, another factor that we have to consider when we're making start-sit decisions on Sunday morning. Last headline I want to talk about is why waivers are so important, because now we have quite a permeation of running back injuries. Dalvin Cook had his shoulder separated, but he's back. DeAndre Swift had a similar injury, but he's going to be out for another few weeks. David Montgomery is out. Elijah Mitchell's out for another 6 weeks. Javonte is out for the entire season. So how do we find fantasy production with all of these fantasy relevant running backs that we drafted in the first 4 rounds now gone? It's basically, you can look at it as a waste of a pick, but no one can predict injuries. And as much as I hate to say it, there will probably be more injuries coming on later in the season. So this is why it's important to have those backup running backs, to have those guys that, you can see have that burst. And when their opportunity comes, when their name gets called, you can start them. I mean, I started Jamal Williams this week, and I was very, very happy with what happened. I know a lot of people who started Khalil Herbert. That ended up being pretty good as well. Not as good as Jamal Williams, but, still came out, still provided some fantasy relevant points. So this is why we have those handcuffs. This is why we have those backup running backs. And I mean, I'm going to harken this back to last year when this was still like a lot of COVID. We're going to wrap back into that first headline because, with concussion protocol, we're going to see kind of that reemergence of that 10-day waiting period if someone happens to show any signs of concussions or any sort of traumatic brain injury. And there's a point with the Chargers last year where I believe Austin Eckler was out, Josh Kelly was out, and then maybe Keenan Allen was out as well. And a lot of people picked up Justin Jackson, who is no longer even with the Chargers anymore. He now plays for the Detroit Lions, but he scored 30.3 points in that game. So this is why managing the waiver wire is not just staying pat with your draft, reacting to injuries, trying to predict who's going to be the next man up is going to be crucial to helping you win your fantasy matchups. So this is just something we wanted to highlight with all those injuries coming out. Those people that have Melvin Gordon now should be really, really excited that they can go ahead and start him with full confidence and not just a flex play anymore, especially against some of those good matchups coming up for the Broncos. I know that just contradicts exactly what I just said in point 2, but when push comes to shove, Melvin Gordon's going to be better than a backup option on the waiver wires. So again, monitor injuries. Try to predict. This is why handcuffs are a thing and why people go out of their way to draft these guys that just sit on their bench for these 1 or 2 week spot starts, because they do become pretty important once these injuries start to pile up. So those are the headlines. Just some things around the league that we want to touch on. So let's get into grading my guys. Little bit of a step back from last week, but let's get into it. First up, we have Jamal Williams, my guy, versus Seattle, probably in the game of the week for fantasy football. I think the total points was 93 total points scored in that game, over 1,100 yards of offense. Yeah, very, very juicy fantasy options there, which we'll definitely be talking about for most of this episode going forward. He finishes with 23.4 points and a touchdown. That is absolutely an A+. In a year where running backs are having an incredibly rough year, putting up points, getting above a 20 point from a backup running back was chef's kiss. Amazing. That was one of the best spot starts of the week. Number 2, going into Kareem Hunt versus Atlanta. That's going to be a D+. He got 7.8 points. It was not the game I expected it to be. Nick Chubb obviously is the dominant running back there. He's one of the best pure runners in the NFL. And I thought Kareem Hunt was going to get involved in the passing game, but just didn't fall. The ball didn't bounce his way and really relied on the back of Nick Chubb. And he broke off, the 32-yard run for a touchdown. Falcons couldn't get anything going. Marcus Mariota looked absolutely lost out there, only had 7 completions. Atlanta was running the ball, and it just never really materialized into a positive game script for Kareem Hunt, so we'll stick with D+ there. 7.8 points isn't going to kill you, but it's not going to help you either. Rashad Bateman, this is the weather, man. This is why weather sucks. He was primed to have an amazing game versus the Bills secondary. Lamar Jackson had been slinging the ball all over the field in the past couple games. This was prime for Rashad Bateman to take care of some lingering injuries in the secondary for the Bills, and just nothing really materialized. Couldn't throw the ball. Lamar seemed to have trouble gripping the ball and actually and that affected his accuracy down the field, where I thought Rashad Bateman was going to kind of get his kind of make his bread was going to be those deep shots on second down and on first down. Obviously, 3.2 points. You're very disappointed with that. You have no idea what to do with Rashad Bateman going forward. So F grade for Rashad there. But, I'm chalking it up to the weather, and I will still continue to have some positivity around the Ravens going forward. Number 4, Chris Olave versus the Vikings over there across the pond in London, England. He finished with a 4.7 total points, and I'll give that an A-. That's what you want from a wide receiver. He got into double digits, but he got into, around that 15 points. And, that's a winning formula, is if you have players around 15 points or more. Obviously, you would have liked to see him get up into the upper teens, but from a rookie who's still trying to find his way with a backup quarterback in Andy Dalton, and things were being run through the tight ends. Taysom Hill was taking a lot of rushes out of the backfield. I think Chris Olave showed that why he was the number 1 overall pick. He played really, really well, held in a touchdown. Very happy if you started Chris Olave. That's going to be 14.7 points, will result in an A-. Last one. And really calling my shot against the Chargers defense here. I've explained multiple times on this channel how the Chargers, while it is a stout defense, despite some injuries to Joey Bosa and on the secondary, they're a defense that really tries to play prevent defense against the pass, and they really invite the run. They want to see how well you can run the ball, and they believe in their front line. We saw this last week with James Robinson, and we saw it this week with Damien Pierce. Both running backs had tremendous games, well into 20 points. So Damien Pierce, 22.9 points, A+. Continue to break out for the surprising round 4 rookie. Doing a lot better than the other rookie running backs so far. So very happy if you started Damien Pierce, and anyone who took him in later on in drafts is very excited for the potential fantasy asset they have going forward. So just to recap, my guys: Jamal Williams, A+, Kareem Hunt, D+, Rashad Bateman, F, Chris Olave, A-, Damien Pierce, A+. Still overall 3 A's. A couple bad grades in there, but more good than bad. I think that's a really good report card to show for week 4, and I'm going to try to keep that train rolling another week going into week 5. So yeah, let's talk studs. And where else do we start than the fantasy game of the week? We all predicted this: Detroit versus Seattle. So obviously, first guy I got to talk about, not QB number 1 on the week, is Jared Goff with 33.2 points. This is just a product of what we've talked about here on the channel, where offenses are shifting away from being driven by the quarterback to schemed as a they're more of a scheme where the quarterback supports the weapons, and the weapons are more dynamic and are more accurate predictor of how well the offense is going to perform than the quarterback position. Less of a responsibility or less of a burden is laid on the quarterback and is spread around to the entire offense. This is why we saw Philly go out and trade for A.J. Brown. This is why Cardinals traded for Hollywood. This is why Tyreek and Devontae Adams went on the moves to Dolphins and Raiders respectively. It's because those are not the top tier quarterbacks, but putting the pieces around them to make them better is allowing these coaches to scheme, make their quarterbacks actually play really well. And obviously we saw that Jared Goff puts up 45 points against a pretty bad Seattle defense and 33.2 points, a few of the stones to start him as a streaming candidate. Congratulations, you did very well. Number 2 is Justin Jefferson, 26.0 points. Again, we talked about it. He's the best wide receiver in the NFL. He had a couple rough games, but that should never let you deter you from someone as talented as Justin Jefferson. You start him with full confidence every single week, and I still am standing by my preseason prediction that he will be the wide receiver 1 on the year. Number 3 here, Rashad Penny, 28.2 points. Man, that was a amazing game. He had us in the first half, not going to lie. He didn't do too great in the first half. Came out, Seattle really ran the offense through their running backs in the second half. He had 2 touchdowns, broke off huge clips, I think a 50-yard run, another 30-yard run as well. Really, this is the guy that they drafted all the way like 4 or 5 years ago. So it was looking really at the end of last week that it was going to really shift to Kenneth Walker, but Rashad Penny said, no, it's not your backfield just yet. I'm still here. I'm still on this team. I'm going to make my name known. So Rashad Penny, good on you. He looked really great running the ball, and it's going to probably be his backfield until he gets injured or gives it up later on this year. Number 4, finally, this is what we wanted to see. Austin Eckler. I know we talked about a few guys that we were going to push the panic button on if we didn't see them do well. Austin Eckler is one of them. He absolutely smashed 3 touchdowns on the year, 3 touchdowns on the week in and of himself, 31.9 points. was the RB1 on the week, had himself an amazing game. Keenan Allen not being there definitely helped. Jalen Guyton with his torn ACL definitely helped, limited who they could use on offense, but it seemed like the Eckler of 2021, who scored 20 touchdowns in the regular season, was back, and boy, would I be excited if I was an Austin Eckler fantasy owner right now. Yesterday's price for Austin is not today's price. He's going to be probably the most valuable running back in fantasy if he can even have close to a similar performance next week if he puts up over 20 points. Just in that dynamic Chargers offense, this is what we saw. This is what we envisioned in the AFC West coming forward. Offenses like this. We wanted pieces like Austin Eckler who were going to put up 3 total touchdowns, who were going to have these offensive explosions, and he came through for us finally after 3 weeks of getting warmed up. Finally, going back to our game of the week, TJ Hawkinson, 35.9 points. Holy cow. Just absolutely dominant from tight end position. Obviously, injuries to DeAndre Swift, DJ Chark, and Amon-Ra St. Brown definitely played a factor in how much utilization TJ Hawkinson did. Once those 3 guys get back on the field, I can't imagine that TJ Hawkinson is probably going to replicate a performance like this, but at least you saw that the talent is there. At least you know that he has the ability to go out there, score touchdowns, be a dominant tight end. He always had the potential, but should be interesting getting those guys back from injury. And then obviously when Jameson Williams joins the team later on, maybe like week 8, 9, 10. But listen, if you have TJ Hawkinson, you're happy. He's doing well, and this shows you the potential that top tight end can have for your team. Except the one person in my league had him on the bench, so I know that was pretty rough. Some honorable mentions: Miles Sanders, 28.6 points. We know the run offense there in Philly is very, very strong, and something that people are going to continue to try to play into and get and suck fantasy points out of. It's just you don't know where it's going. There's so many different options, whether it's Devonta Smith, AJ Brown, Kenneth Gainwell, who got a touchdown, Jalen Hurts running the touchdowns themselves. So Miles Sanders, as long as they're scoring points, there's going to be points to go around, but you can't really predict who's going to get them. Like, they won last week versus the Commanders, had a really good matchup, but Miles Sanders only had 5.4 points last week. This week, he turns it on his head, gets 28.6 points. But knowing that Nick Sirianni runs a very run-dominant offense is good things for Miles Sanders going forward. Jamal Williams, we already talked about him, 23.4, was the RB1 for the Detroit Lions, who have the most points scored in the NFL through week 4, despite their 1-3 record. So, yeah, just take pieces of that offense. Tyreek Hill, he had a bad game this week. This is what the volatility of Tyreek Hill does. He will bring you 1 week. He'll win you a week this week. Also, Tyreek was playing against me, which is why I knew he was going to go off this week. But 20.9 points is very good for Tyreek. Obviously, the Waddle injury contributed to that. Hopefully, Waddle can get back out there and be full strength here very shortly. Speaking in regards to Tua, I don't think the Tua injury is going to impact Waddle or Tyreek's fantasy relevance too much. I talked about this last week in the week 4 preview, where I believe that the scheme that Mike McDaniel runs is not Tua-centric. I believe that Teddy Bridgewater can facilitate it very well with at least a week of practice under the belt and playing with the number 1 team. So I believe the strength lies in what Mike McDaniel can cook up and the ability to have a competent quarterback manage the offense. And it wasn't truly in the massive step that Tua took. So I still think that under the guise of Mike McDaniel, Tyreek and Waddle should be just fine. Travis Kelce, what can you say? This man's a weekly visitor to the studs list, 19.7 points. Gotta love it. Patrick Mahomes looked amazing, by far the best QB in the league currently, and really shows how good that Travis Kelce is, that the Buccaneers knew that he was throwing him to him, and he still got the ball. CeeDee Lamb continued his breakout from last week, 18.7 points this week. Hollywood, 17.8. That connection with Kyler seems really good. He made some really spectacular catches, including one in the end zone. It will be interesting to see how that changes once D-Hop comes back in a couple of weeks, but for now, Hollywood has got to be a must-start player. Nick Chubb, best pure runner, 19.7 points, is the heart and soul of that Browns offense. Derrick Henry, 22.2 points. This is the Derrick Henry we all know and love. After a rough start, he's now driving the offense for the Titans, and when Derrick Henry goes off for over 100 yards and a touchdown, then this is the games that the Titans win. So as long as Derrick Henry can keep this up, Titans outlook does look good. T. Higgins was Joe Burrow's wide receiver of choice, landing with 21.9 points. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, a guy that I was kind of fading going into the week, ended up with 21.9 points. He just looks really good. Clyde Edwards-Helaire and the next guy on this list, Josh Jacobs, with 32 points. Both guys that, were in that RB dead zone that people were fading, that people had said, listen, they're older. They haven't been utilized the way we want them to. This could be their year 3 and year 4 renaissance for both Josh Jacobs and Clyde Edwards-Helaire. They both look very good and very crucial pieces of their respective offenses. Mike Evans, after the back from the suspension, 26.3 points, number 1 wide receiver, and you have the GOAT thrown to you, so you're probably good. Russell Wilson, there you go, Russ, finally back in the positives. 23 points or so, depending on your scoring format. Geno Smith was our quarterback 2 on the week, also part of that amazing fantasy game. He had 31.4 points. I actually started him over Matt Stafford, and I got rewarded for having balls of steel for starting Geno Smith over Matt Stafford, and very happy to see him become a fantasy MVP. C-Mac, Christian McCaffrey, first game over 20 points, scored 21.3. This is the game you wanted to see. Got a garbage time touchdown to kind of drive those points up as well. But this is the guy that can go out there and is going to be the number 1 offensive piece for the Panthers, and this is why you drafted him 101 or 102. Damien Pierce, continued breakout, not much options else on the Texans, and he looks like a really, really pure runner. J.K. Dobbins finally had his renaissance after being on a snap count last week, came out, scored 2 touchdowns, 20.3 points, is going to be a crucial part of that run offense up there in Ravens country, and will be a must start every week going forward. Debo, 20.7 points, and Cooper Kupp were 19.2 points, were the lone offensive bright spots of this Monday Night Football game. That was a snooze fest all around otherwise. So those are the studs we want to talk about. Now a little bit on the downer side, we're going to talk about our duds. Devonte Williams has to lead off this list because he had the massive injury, exited the game with only 3.2 points. A lot of people who were drafting him in the second round thought this was going to be his breakout year. Unfortunately, like Trey Lance, this will not be his breakout year. He's going to have a long way back from injury, and hopefully he can come back soon. Kyle Pitts. Sell. This is, get rid of it. You cannot trust Kyle Pitts at this point. He's too uninvolved in that offense. He's not being utilized the way he should be as the athletic freak that he tested at in the combine. He looks like a pretty big bust if you took him in the 3rd or 4th round. I can't say I didn't call this one. I did recommend to avoid him prior to draft season, but again, a guy that you just don't have faith in, and Marcus Mariota is not finding him with the ball. While he still has name value, I recommend you go sell him. Alvin Kamara obviously had 0 points, and that's because he didn't play. But this is just a weird situation I want to talk about where, again, it was a London game. The game kicked off at 9:30 a.m. Eastern time. Most people were still asleep, especially on the West Coast, Mountain Time or Central Time. And there was no indication prior to the game that he was going to sit. So that was obviously something that was incredibly concerning, and a lot of people left Alvin Kamara in their lineups, and he probably submarined them. Hopefully you have benevolent commissioners that allowed you to switch out him for another player once they realized that a lot of people got screwed over by the way the Saints handled that injury. So he's on the duds because he did screw over a lot of people, especially if your commissioner was not a nice person. Jonathan Taylor, 2.8 points. I can't worry about Jonathan Taylor. He's so good of a running back that none of this is going to dissuade me. I'm going to start him every single week, no matter what. I understand he has a toe injury, and if he is out, then yeah. If he's questionable, then maybe you try to find a pivot. But at this point, Jonathan Taylor is so crucial to that offense that you have to play him every week in and week out. I would not be concerned, frankly. I just wouldn't. I know it's been 3 bad weeks for Jonathan Taylor, but he's Jonathan Taylor. That's all I have to say about that. Amari Cooper, yep, 2 good weeks, come back down to earth with 1.7 points this week. We did know that offensive attack, the offensive onslaught last week by Jacoby Brissett was probably a fluke, not something that I don't think was sustainable. I avoided going against pass catching options in Cleveland prior to this week, and this is why. I didn't want to end with 1.7 points. Some honorable mentions in the duds category. We got Jalen Waddle, 4.9 points, obviously still struggling with that injury, something to monitor going forward, and maybe a player that you sit if he still is missing practices and sitting out practices. Drake London, just the nature of the game script, they just ran the ball. The Falcons ran the ball. Marcus Mariota only had 7 completions. Drake London's too talented not to play. I'm not worried. James Robinson, after 3 amazing weeks, had his first dead game of 2.9 points. He's still, just based on snap count, is still the RB1 down there in Jacksonville. It was a really bad matchup against the Eagles, who have one of the top defenses in the league right now, so wouldn't worry too much about that. He'll be back in my starting lineup very, very soon. I just wasn't going to avoid this matchup just based on how awful it was. Terry McLaurin, he currently looks like the wide receiver 3 on that offense behind Curtis Samuel and Jahan Dotson. Another 2.5 point game from Terry McLaurin is leaving me very concerned. I don't think he's a startable asset at this point. Darren Waller, 3.9 points. Listen, stock's up on the Raiders right now. We saw them pull out their first win. I think things are going to start clicking. I think Waller's going to get back in and start figuring stuff out. This is obviously a bad result for this week, but going forward, Josh Jacobs is not going to have the amount of work that he had this past week. Darren Waller will get involved. Adams will get involved. Hopefully, Carr starts to figure out some consistency and some rhythm with the offense. Things will get better for Darren Waller. I'm not concerned about him. Gabe Davis, 1.8 points. This is a very, very vicious cycle of both that weather that we talked about earlier in the episode, as well as still coming off of that injury. So Gabe Davis does not concern me. If you can sell him, if you can trade him, people are probably looking to buy low on him right now. So if you have excess at wide receiver, you can certainly trade him. After a few bad games, I'm sure people's faith in him has been shaken, but I wouldn't worry too much about Gabe Davis going forward. Naji Harris, I don't know what to do. This is a first-round pick that a lot of people had in their leagues. It just seems like the Steelers' offense is just an absolute farce of any sort of offensive explosivity. So not really sure what's going on there. Naji really hasn't been getting involved. He was salvaged last week with a touchdown run, but couldn't get in the end zone this week. Only ends up with 7.4 points. I'm sure it's not what you expect with a first-round pick. Mark Andrews, 2.5 points. Weather, not worried. We saw what he did the past 2 weeks. Devonte Smith kind of goes in the same line as Miles Sanders. Obviously, Miles Sanders, bad game last week, great game this week. Devonta Smith, great game last week, bad game this week, but the Eagles are still firing on all cylinders. They're the only undefeated team left in the NFL currently. So you gotta play your pieces. You gotta have they have a lot of offensive weapons between Sanders, Gainwell, Hurts, Goddard, Smith, and Brown. So I mean, they're not all going to produce all the time. There's not enough points to go around to all those offensive weapons. You just got to, play who you think is going to play well that week. And if you need something a little bit safer, then maybe pivot to a different option, but they definitely have that upside every single week. Michael Pittman is another one that's concerning. The same aspect of Jonathan Taylor, where there's so few offensive weapons that it seems that defenses are really honing in on stopping both Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman. This is going to be his second week in a row, if we exclude the week with injury, of having a pretty poor performance. So hopefully they can try to revamp things and bring in more offensive weapons. It seems like Matt Ryan really wants to get the tight ends involved in Indianapolis, but apart from that, it is kind of concerning with how much focus went through Jonathan Taylor and Michael Pittman and how easy it is for defenses to stop them. On the other side, look at Deontay Johnson. The shift to Kenny Pickett has me extremely worried here. Kenny Pickett really targeted George Pickens. Deontay does not seem to have a rapport with Kenny Pickett, and he ended up with 3.2 points. I'm not going to start him. I would rather start George Pickens going forward just because we saw the connection and how much the target share was different for George Pickens after Kenny Pickett came into the game. Travis Etienne, same thing as James Robinson. It was just a bad matchup on the ground. The Jaguars look flustered. It's going to take a little bit of time to get used to him. Rashad Bateman, 3.2 points. I talked about why he had a bad game versus the Bills in my guys review section. And Garrett Wilson, listen, Zach Wilson's first game, we talked about this last week, have a little bit of a trepidation when it comes into that quarterback change, a little bit of time to get things settled. He's not going to throw the ball 50 times like Joe Flacco did. Zach Wilson looked fairly competent, led the Jets to a win over the Steelers. So Garrett Wilson is still an asset that I'm going to hold on to. If you can buy low on him, definitely buy low, but he's a guy that I definitely think is going to only increase in value as the season goes on. And finally, Allen Robinson, 1.7 points, droppable. He is droppable at this point. Last season was not a fluke. He is not getting any sort of relevant target share. He's not catching anything even thrown his way when Matt Stafford does target him. I think only like 2 targets tonight at Monday Night Football. Allen Robinson is droppable. All right. Okay, that was a lot of duds that we had to talk about. Hopefully those sections aren't as long going forward because that's just not fun for fantasy. Let's go to waivers. Waivers are pretty bare, but there are some guys that we just got to talk about that you, if you have some spots on your team, definitely roster them. Number 1, Geno Smith. Again, this is going to be a repeat waiver of last week, but listen, this is the guy that has such an amazing matchup going forward. He looks really, really poised and really, really competent in that Pete Carroll offense up there in Seattle, and we saw him put up 31.4 fantasy points this week. He's a guy that I'm going to continue to start over Matt Stafford, over Russell Wilson, over a lot of these guys, over Tom Brady, over Aaron Rodgers. And he has rushing upside. He'll get you an extra 2 to 4 points on the ground every game. So with his really good stretch of matchups coming up, he's a guy that I definitely want to roster. Tyler Algier, we saw him get heavily involved, especially with Marcus Mariota's incompetence when it came to the passing game. Also, Cordero Patterson has now been sent to the IR with a knee injury for at least 4 weeks. So Tyler Algier looked really good in the game. Got to pick him up. I think Caleb Huntley, he played really well, but Tyler Algier was the one that impressed me the most watching that game, and is the running back to have in this Falcons backfield. Number 3 does not excite me. It's Robert Woods. I dropped him earlier this year, but he, with Treylon Burks' injury, I believe he has a toe injury, with some of the other inconsistencies around Austin Hooper and the other offensive weapons there in Tennessee. Robert Woods seems to get a touchdown on a weekly basis. So if you're looking for a guy who's going to give you a safe floor, going to give you about 10 to 12 points, Robert Woods is definitely a guy you can pick up and start, as he should be the presumed number 1 in Tennessee going forward. Number 4, a guy I alluded to when we talked about Deontay Johnson in the duds section, George Pickens. The target share when Kenny Pickett came into the game for George Pickens was absolutely insane. He looks really, really good. Looks to be Kenny Pickett's favorite target so far. As Kenny Pickett was reported today that he's going to take over the offense full time. Mitch Trubisky is now officially sat. I expect George Pickens to only get better and better, and he's immensely talented. Only fell in the draft due to character concerns, but hopefully Mike Tomlin and the Steelers can keep that under wraps, and he should be a very dominant fantasy wide receiver if that target share continues to go forward. Racked up over 100 yards this past week, which is crazy. Lastly, listen, if defenses are going to target Jonathan Taylor and if defenses are going to stop Michael Pittman, get a tight end. We saw last week that Jelani Woods got 2 touchdowns. This week is Mo Alley-Cox that got 2 touchdowns. If you don't have a tight end, or if you're kind of stuck in tight end purgatory with the Kyle Pitts or the Cole Kmets or the Dawson Knoxes of the world, go get Mo Alley-Cox. The touchdown upside is phenomenal out there. And especially with some of their upcoming matchups against some easier opponents in the Texans and the Jaguars, I expect Mo Alley-Cox or Jelani Woods, whichever tight end you have the fervor to start, to have at least, get you that 10 points that you want from that tight end fantasy position. Guys to avoid on the waivers, I'm going to talk about Josh Reynolds. Again, a product of so many injuries in that Detroit offense. As soon as Amon-Ra, as soon as DJ Chark comes back, as soon as DeAndre Swift is back in the fold, I don't think he'll be relevant. Same thing with Jamal Agnew. He had a great game, scoring 17 points, but again, he was a product of the Zay Jones system. He played the exact same role Zay Jones has played. When Zay Jones is healthy, I expect Zay Jones to be back next week. If you want to take a flyer on a Jags wide receiver, still go after Zay Jones. Jamal Agnew is not going to supplant him going forward. Okay. That was a lot of information. This might be our longest episode yet, but there's a ton of stuff to talk about. So many injuries, so many question marks surrounding players, and so many bounce backs that we had to discuss. So this has been a truly wonderful week in fantasy football. I'm so glad I get to enjoy it with you. I hope this has helped you. I hope you guys get all the waivers that you need tonight to make your team successful going forward. This is quarter 1 of the fantasy season in the books, and looking forward to the rest of the season. Take care.